January 20th, 1961. A new president stands in the icy wind, delivering what many consider the most iconic line in American politics. Ask not what your country can do for you, ask what you can do for your country. It inspired generations, launched service programs, and became a rallying cry for patriotism. But beneath the soaring rhetoric lies a story of Cold War fear, racial unrest, and a nation on edge. In this video, we'll unpack the quote's real meaning, its lasting impact, and why it still stirs debate more than 60 years later. In January 1961, America stood at a crossroads. World War II had ended less than 2 decades earlier, but its shadow loomed large. The Cold War was now in full swing. Anxieties about nuclear war, communist expansion, and ideological confrontation colored everyday life. At home, the civil rights movement was gathering momentum, but the country was still deeply segregated. In this climate of fear and potential, the inauguration of a new president felt electric. The air buzzed with anticipation, not just of policy, but of direction. Americans weren't just watching a transfer of power, they were wondering whether the nation itself might be entering a new era. When John F. Kennedy stepped up to speak, he wasn't just addressing a crowd, he was addressing a world unsure of what came next. John F. Kennedy represented something the country hadn't seen before. At 43, he was the youngest person ever elected president, and the firstborn in the 20th century. He brought with him not just a new generation, but a different kind of energy. Youthful, eloquent, confident. A war hero from a wealthy, politically connected family, Kennedy managed to balance elite polish with mass appeal. To his supporters, he embodied the American ideal, a leader who could match the gravity of the Cold War with a forward-looking vision. His Catholicism broke barriers. His televised debates made politics feel modern. Whether you believed in him or not, there was no denying his presence. He wasn't just taking office, he was redefining what the presidency could mean in a rapidly changing world. Kennedy's inaugural address didn't materialize overnight. Behind its polished cadence was weeks of work, most notably with his longtime aide and speechwriter, Ted Sorensen. Together they combed through history, Lincoln's resolve, FDR's moral urgency, biblical cadences, to craft something timeless. Every word was tested, every phrase shaped for impact. The goal was clarity without fear, inspiration without naivety. Kennedy knew the stakes. He wasn't just delivering a speech, he was setting a tone for an era shadowed by missiles and civil unrest. The structure was intentional, short, rhythmic sentences that built momentum. It was designed not just to be heard, but to be remembered. And it worked. The speech quickly took on a mythic status, but its most famous line almost didn't make it in. Kennedy's soaring rhetoric often masked a steely core. Though remembered as a call to unity, the inaugural address was fundamentally shaped by the Cold War. When he spoke of passing the torch, it wasn't just about age, it was about confronting a new kind of enemy. The speech bristled with warnings, promises to pay any price, bear any burden, and oppose any foe. These weren't abstractions, they were aimed directly at the Soviet Union. The message to Moscow was clear: America would not back down. In that context, even the most poetic passages had a strategic edge. The speech was, at its heart, a declaration of resolve. It invited Americans to stand firm, not just for themselves, but for a vision of freedom locked in global contest. Idealism and hard power fused in a single voice. Then came the line. Tucked near the end, it arrived with the force of revelation. Ask not what your country can do for you, ask what you can do for your country. In just 17 words, Kennedy flipped the script on American individualism. It was elegant, almost biblical in rhythm, and it crystallized the speech's deeper appeal, a call to sacrifice, to national duty, to shared purpose. For many, it was a moment of awakening, a civic epiphany that inspired volunteers, teachers, Peace Corps recruits. But beneath the shine was something more complicated. The line simplified a country in turmoil, asking unity without fully confronting injustice. Still, in that moment, it didn't matter. The crowd erupted. The myth was born. And the quote would echo through classrooms, campaign trails, and history itself. The moment JFK delivered his now iconic line, it ricocheted across the country. Newspapers reprinted it in bold headlines. Editorials praised its clarity and courage. Americans clipped it out and pinned it to their refrigerators, posted it in classrooms, and read it aloud at civic events. The phrase spread like wildfire, not just because it sounded good, but because it struck a nerve. In an age of uncertainty, it offered clarity. In a time of fear, it offered purpose. Within days, it had become more than a quote. It was a creed. Letters poured into the White House from citizens ready to serve. School children were taught to recite it, and for a generation coming of age during the Cold War, it felt like a mission statement, clear, noble, and worth believing in. To understand why the line landed so powerfully, you have to look at the cultural moment. This was a prosperous time. America had booming suburbs, growing wages, and a rising middle class. But beneath the surface, there was a kind of spiritual drift. After the trauma of World War II and the conformity of the 1950s, many Americans were searching for a deeper sense of identity. The call to ask what you can do wasn't just patriotic, it was existential. It told people their lives could mean something beyond consumption or comfort. For a generation raised on sacrifice, the idea of public service had emotional weight. And for younger Americans, it promised purpose in an uncertain world. Kennedy wasn't just appealing to civic duty, he was offering a way to matter. Kennedy understood the power of symbolism. From the very start, he framed his presidency not as an administration, but as a calling. He spoke of torch passing, of frontiers, of national missions. Ask not wasn't a standalone line. It was the foundation of an entire mythos. His speeches, his policies, even the way he carried himself, all were designed to reinforce a story that this was a time of noble struggle and Americans had a role to play. The Peace Corps, the space race, the idea of Camelot. These weren't just programs, they were narrative threads in a larger tale about collective purpose. In just over 1,000 days, JFK built a legacy that outlived him, and it all started with a single sentence that asked Americans to believe in something bigger. In the United States, words have always mattered. Lincoln redefined a nation with the Gettysburg Address. FDR steadied it with fireside chats. Reagan reframed it with sunny optimism. But Kennedy did something different. He led with language before action. His presidency was shaped not by long-term legislation, but by the emotional force of his words. Ask not was a promise, a challenge, and a rallying cry rolled into one. It gave the illusion of consensus even in a fractured country. That's the unique American dynamic. We elevate presidents through their rhetoric, not just their results. JFK's speech didn't just reflect national values, it helped define them. And in doing so, it blurred the line between inspiration and expectation, between speaking to the people and scripting the role they were supposed to play. But not everyone could play that role. For all its elegance, Ask Not implied a shared stake that didn't exist equally. In 1961, black Americans in the Jim Crow South were being denied basic rights. Women were largely excluded from power. Many Americans were still waiting for the country to do something for them before they could do something for it. So while the line stirred pride, it also stirred discomfort. Who exactly was being asked to sacrifice? And for what kind of nation? These questions didn't negate the quote's power, but they revealed its limits. Kennedy's call to unity was inspiring, but it glossed over real divisions. And in that tension, we start to see how a single sentence could both elevate a nation and leave parts of it behind. Ask not what your country can do for you may sound like pure civic virtue, but in 1961 that virtue had a target, the Soviet Union. Kennedy's call to action was inseparable from Cold War priorities. Service meant loyalty to a global strategy, defeating communism, defending capitalism, and preserving American influence abroad. The line wasn't just about moral character, it was a recruitment pitch for national unity in a time of ideological war. Underneath the call for selflessness was a strategic message: conform, contribute, and align with American power. For some, this felt noble. For others, it raised a question. Was this service freely given or subtly demanded? And more pointedly, who got to define what counted as patriotism and what didn't? The Peace Corps was the purest embodiment of Kennedy's ideal. Announced just weeks after his inauguration, it gave young Americans a chance to serve in underdeveloped countries, promoting education, public health, and agriculture. It was service as diplomacy, boots-on-the-ground idealism with a global reach. Thousands signed up, eager to build bridges and better the world. But critics saw a different story. They questioned whether the program was less about global goodwill and more about countering Soviet influence in the Third World. Was the Peace Corps a tool for development or a vehicle for soft power dominance? The tension between altruism and agenda was baked in. And even as it inspired genuine progress, it reminded the world that American service often carried American interests in its pocket. Meanwhile, another form of service, far less voluntary, was unfolding. The military draft asked young Americans to fight and sometimes die for their country. But the burden wasn't shared equally. College deferments and connections meant that wealthier, often white men could avoid combat. Meanwhile, working-class Americans, especially Black and Latino men, were disproportionately sent to Vietnam's front lines. The ideal of ask what you can do turned bitter when what was being asked came with life and death consequences, and when those consequences fell hardest on those with the least power. The myth of equal sacrifice cracked under pressure. Service became stratified. And the very quote meant to inspire unity began to reveal a deeper truth. The American ideal wasn't applied equally. For many Black Americans, JFK's appeal to service rang hollow. How could one be asked to give to a country that had yet to grant full citizenship? In 1961, segregation was still law in much of the South. Black voters were disenfranchised. Schools, buses, lunch counters, all separate and unequal. To many, the phrase, "what you can do for your country," felt more like an obligation than an invitation. The "we" in Kennedy's speech excluded too many. Leaders like James Baldwin, Fannie Lou Hamer, and Malcolm X didn't need to critique the line directly. Reality did it for them. It wasn't that Black Americans lacked the will to serve, it's that they were being asked to give without being equally seen, heard, or protected. The national myth was powerful, but it wasn't universal. Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. never publicly challenged Kennedy's famous line, but in many ways his vision stood in quiet contrast to it. King didn't ask for blind sacrifice, he demanded justice. Where JFK called for service, King called for accountability. His sermons emphasized moral clarity over national unity, arguing that loyalty to country must never eclipse loyalty to conscience. In his later years, especially as he criticized the Vietnam War, King made it clear, service must be tied to truth. He urged Americans not just to ask what they could do, but to ask whether what they were doing was right. It was a deeper kind of patriotism, one that didn't reject Kennedy's call outright, but insisted that love of country required the courage to confront its flaws. When Kennedy called on Americans to serve, his words carried the weight of masculine expectation. The imagery was martial, the tone assertive, and the examples, military duty, Cold War diplomacy, space exploration, centered men. Women, meanwhile, were largely left out of the vision. Few institutional roles existed for them to answer the call beyond domestic support or auxiliary programs. The Peace Corps and other service efforts included women, but always on the margins, rarely in leadership. The idea of civic duty remained narrowly defined. Feminist thinkers would later ask, who gets invited to serve, and on whose terms? Kennedy's quote didn't actively exclude women, but it assumed a public life still dominated by men. And in doing so, it reinforced a vision of service that often sidelined half the population. Kennedy's assassination in 1963 froze his words in time. Ask not stopped being just a quote. It became a shrine. In the national grief that followed, critical distance vanished. The line and the speech it came from were transformed into sacred text. To question them felt almost profane. As the 60s wore on, through Vietnam, civil unrest, and generational rebellion, Kennedy's words remained protected, insulated from the chaos unfolding around them. His image hardened into myth, youthful, noble, martyred. And in that process, the real context of his presidency, its compromises, contradictions, and limitations, faded. Ask not became a memory of what America wanted to believe it once was. A moment of national unity preserved in amber, just as the country was starting to fall apart. In the 1980s and beyond, conservative leaders found new life in Kennedy's words. Ronald Reagan famously cited, "Ask not" as a bipartisan ideal, a call to patriotism above party. But in doing so, the quote's original Cold War logic was retooled for a different agenda: smaller government, stronger military, and a return to American exceptionalism. George H.W. Bush echoed the same sentiment, tying duty to a sense of quiet obedience. The irony was stark. A Democrat's call for service was now fueling conservative visions of discipline and power. The quote was no longer tied to JFK's New Frontier, but to tax cuts, foreign interventions, and symbolic unity. Stripped from context, it became a flexible slogan, used less to challenge citizens and more to rally them behind whatever national project was at hand. After the attacks of September 11, 2001, Kennedy's words made another return. In a moment of shock and fear, "Ask not" was revived as a unifying refrain. Politicians and pundits repeated it in speeches, op-eds, and public ceremonies. But the definition of service became hazy. Citizens were told to shop, to wave flags, to support troops, rarely to make real sacrifices or question national policy. As the wars in Iraq and Afghanistan unfolded, critics began to ask, are we being called to participate or simply to comply? JFK's quote was used to invoke unity, but not always to demand accountability. In a world of drone strikes, mass surveillance, and widening inequality, the simplicity of "ask not" clashed with the complexity of post-9/11 reality. Once again, the line was powerful, but its meaning had drifted. There's a reason the line endures. It speaks to something admirable: selflessness, humility, the idea that citizenship is about contribution, not just rights. It offers a moral compass in moments of drift, but it also carries risks. It can be used to suppress dissent, to discourage demands for justice, or to paint criticism as unpatriotic. It can turn service into obligation and loyalty into silence. Kennedy's quote, at its best, challenges us to think beyond ourselves, but at its worst, it can flatten the complexity of civic life into a single, unquestioning narrative. That's why it remains both celebrated and debated. Because wrapped inside its elegance is a tension that America still hasn't resolved: how to serve a country that doesn't always serve everyone equally. Today, many young Americans still believe in making a difference, but they're skeptical about who's asking them to serve. Institutions that once inspired trust now feel distant, corrupt, or broken. Government, often gridlocked, corporations, driven by profit, even some nonprofits seem out of touch. It's not that the idea of service has died, it's that belief in traditional power structures has eroded. When people hear, "ask what you can do for your country," the instinctive response is often, "What has my country done for me or for people like me?" The cynicism isn't laziness, it's protective. It's born from witnessing injustice and inequality. And yet, beneath that skepticism is still a desire to belong to something larger. The quote hasn't lost relevance, it just needs a new context. What does your country mean in an interconnected world? For some, it's still the flag, the Constitution, the civic rituals. For others, it's their neighborhood, their people, or even the planet itself. In the 21st century, identity isn't just national, it's personal, global, hybrid. So when we talk about service today, it doesn't have to mean marching to a capital's drumbeat. It might mean serving your city, your cause, your climate. The quote, "Ask what you can do for your country," doesn't need to be abandoned, but it can be reinterpreted. Maybe country is no longer a fixed entity. Maybe it's a living idea, one we help shape through our values, our labor, and our love. That shift doesn't weaken the quote. It deepens it. The old model of service often meant uniforms, ranks, and hierarchies, but today that definition is expanding: teaching in underfunded schools, caring for an elderly parent, organizing food banks, or fighting misinformation online. These acts don't make headlines, but they build resilience. In an age of climate collapse, rising inequality, and digital fragmentation, service looks less like standing at attention and more like showing up where you're needed most. It's community-based, care-focused, often unpaid or under-recognized. And it's often done by those who've already been let down by the systems they're now trying to fix. That's not a lesser form of patriotism. It might be a purer one. Service today isn't about pledging allegiance. It's about taking responsibility, especially when institutions won't. All across the country and beyond it, people are answering Kennedy's call in quiet, powerful ways. They're joining AmeriCorps, launching mutual aid networks, tutoring kids, staffing shelters, planting trees, fighting evictions. They're not waiting for permission or presidential speeches. They're taking action on their own terms. These new volunteers may never quote JFK, but they live the spirit of ask not every day. Their service is decentralized, scrappy, often invisible, but essential. It doesn't look like the Peace Corps of the 60s. It looks like climate justice marches, open source code for social good, and community clinics run by volunteers. It's harder to mythologize, but maybe that's the point. Service today is not about legacy, it's about impact, and it's already happening. At the heart of Kennedy's quote is a powerful idea, that we owe something to each other and to the place we call home. But true patriotism isn't obedience, it's participation. It's knowing that loving your country means holding it to its highest promises. That means protest, it means criticism, it means truth-telling. Ask not what your country can do for you doesn't mean stay silent. It means show up with clarity, with compassion, with courage. Informed patriotism is active. It asks questions, challenges injustice, and pushes for better. And in that sense, the quote is still alive. Not because it's perfect, but because it invites us to keep striving for a country worthy of our service and a service worthy of our country. To truly reclaim ask not, we have to listen to the voices it overlooked. In 1961, many Americans were left out of the national narrative. Indigenous communities fighting for sovereignty, civil rights organizers risking everything for equal protection, immigrants navigating exclusion while building the country's backbone. Today, these same groups are helping redefine what service means. It's not just about duty to a flag. It's about honoring lived experience, protecting land, defending justice, and building systems that don't leave anyone behind. When those who were once excluded reshape the story, the quote gains depth. It becomes not just a call to serve, but a challenge to include, to widen the we that Kennedy once invoked, and to ask who gets to speak for the country at all. Kennedy's presidency was far from perfect. He escalated Cold War tensions, hesitated on civil rights, and governed in an era that excluded many. But his ability to inspire still matters. His quote wasn't just rhetoric. It was an attempt to elevate the national conversation. He believed people could be moved not by fear, but by purpose. That belief, even in a deeply flawed context, has power. It reminds us that leadership can challenge us to think bigger, to act with conscience, to imagine the public good as something worth striving for. Kennedy's legacy isn't spotless, but neither is any honest vision of progress. What matters is the spark he lit. The idea that service, when rooted in justice, can change a life or a nation. So where does that leave us? The quote doesn't need to be discarded, it needs to be reimagined. Today, we don't have to choose between self-care and service or between criticism and commitment. We can ask better questions. How do we serve without erasing difference? How do we build together without demanding uniformity? The spirit of ask not can still guide us, but only if we expand it beyond the narrow frame of its time. It's not about heroic sacrifice for a flawless nation. It's about helping build a more honest, inclusive, and equitable one. The call isn't just to do more, it's to think more deeply about what we're doing and who we're doing it for. In the end, the question isn't just what you can do for your country, it's what kind of country you want to help build. Kennedy gave us a sentence. It's up to us to write the next paragraph. One rooted in justice, in honesty, and in the belief that service must include everyone, not just the privileged, not just the patriotic, but the critical, the hopeful, and the unheard. So share this if it made you think, and maybe the next time someone asks what you can do, you'll have an answer that's your own, one shaped by your values, your vision, and the future you want to help create. So if this made you rethink what patriotism really asks of us, don't forget to subscribe, like the video, and leave a comment below. We'd love to hear your take. What does service mean to you today, and who do you think gets to define it? And if you're curious how another iconic quote shaped a generation in a completely different way, check out our last video on Margaret Thatcher's infamous line, "No one owes you anything." It's a look at how a single sentence became the backbone of an entire economic worldview.